Volume 1 Chapter 5.2. Love Again. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Hey, wake up. The nudge shook Alok's body. Alok barely lifted his heavy eyelids as if it was under a huge statue, and he could see a blurred silhouette. Oh, it's you. Don't exaggerate it. The cold words lowered his body temperature by another degree. Even as Alok fought to stay awake, his eyes closed and sank back into the darkness, and a cold sigh could be heard in his dazed ears. That man clicked his tongue as he let out a hot breath through his slightly parted lips. Are you being on purpose with washing all the blankets when the temperature has dropped, or are you just stupid? Are you being arrogant because you got pregnant? The fireplace is not a decoration. Alok wanted to say that he tried to light it, but his words couldn't come out properly. As he heard a murmur of curses, he felt a heavy thing covering his body. It was a men's coat with a chilly, smooth texture, and it was a little heavy. It was also very large. Like a blanket, the high-end clothing wrapped around Alok's whole body smelled bitter. Alok instinctively curled up more and breathed in the fabric full of that man's body scent. The scent that filled his lungs at once calmed down his feverish stomach. Was it because he was the father of the child in his belly? Maybe it was simply because he was an alpha who Alok had his heat with. Either way, the alpha's body scent gave warm protection to the emotional pregnant Omega with the high fever. Klopp didn't leave right away after throwing off his coat. He was touching here and there from over the table. He was probably looking at the fireplace. There was a hollow sound of something falling on the floor, and Alok heard a fierce condemnation. You can't even make a fire without a house servant. What a useless fellow. Being half asleep, Alok curled up a little more, wrapping his arms around his body. He knew how to light a fire in the oven, so he thought he would be able to make a fire in the fireplace soon. He moved his body, which was heating up, brought 3 or 4 heavy pieces of firewood from outside, and tried to light the fireplace several times. However, no matter how many matches and flints he struck, the hard log wouldn't catch fire, and even when it was barely lit, only a little smoke rose and it would soon go out. He quit because he felt suffocated by the smoke. He could hear a thud of footsteps and the sound of the door being opened and closed. And the steps sounded further and further away. It seemed like that man had left. Alok pulled up the coat to cover more of his body, and buried his nose in the collar, the scent coming out deeply. He slightly rubbed his cheeks against it like a baby. There was no such thing as pride. He was just relieved by his own alpha body scent. It was a relief that the man gave his coat to him. Even if Klopp was spouting harsh words, he couldn't pretend not to see Alok for the sake of the baby fetus. Klopp was that kind of person. Klopp wanted a child. No matter what would happen to Alok, the child would always be cared for. This time too, it was clear that as soon as Alok gave birth, Klopp would take the baby away before Alok's dirty hands even managed to reach for the baby. When Alok thought of that day that would come, he felt like a wind drilled a hole in his heart. Alok wished Klopp would at least show him the baby's face. Ah! As the fever rose, it made him think of impossible things. Regardless of the situation, it would be better for the baby to grow up as a fine aristocrat in a warm and clean mansion than to grow up as a criminal's child in this cold cottage. Even though it was only a coat, Alok felt warm and fell asleep. Later, he sweated a little because it was too warm, so he tossed his body around and slightly lowered his coat. He was sure that he felt the cold night air was warm. This couldn't be happening. It was always cold in this windy cottage. What was going on? There was a pleasant sound of burning dry oak and a bitter scent. Alok forced his eyes open. The dusty fireplace was burning red. Who did it? The door opened and a familiar man came in. He walked with his arms wide, took the damp blanket that Alok had hung outside, and hung it in front of the fireplace. The man went to the kitchen next door without realizing that Alok was awake. Soon, Alok could hear the sound of things being moved. It was such a small and quiet cottage that Alok could even hear a low curse muttered by the man. Alok couldn't hear it properly, but he thought he heard the man saying that dog food would be better than this. Alok suddenly felt ashamed. Perhaps this was not much different from what Raphael had felt before. Unlike that innocent and gentle man, no one would kiss Alok's blistered fingers. His neck suddenly cowered. At times like this, he should just be more confident, but now he just wanted to hide in the cozy coat. After the sound of clattering in the kitchen continued for a while, Klopp came out with a clean dirty pot. Instead of the chair near the bedside, Klopp pulled out the other chair next to the table, which had always been used in that place, and sat down near the fireplace. He took a small lump out of the pot that he put on the floor and began to cut it with the knife in his hand. It was a potato. Unlike Alok, who would scathe his fingers every time he cut a potato, Klopp skillfully cut it well with his big hands. The pretty, shiny potatoes looked very appetizing in the red glow of the fireplace. He quickly cut off one and took another. The movement of his long fingers touching the light orange dot-colored potato was like a craftsman working with pumpkins. It was extremely delicate and elegant. So his strong and fierce hands could move like that. Alok took a peek mesmerizingly at the man through the gap in the collar of his coat. Soon, Klopp had finished peeling all the potatoes and took the pot back to the kitchen. It was a shame as Alok wanted to see more of his fingers. After a while, Klopp hung a pot filled with potatoes and other things over the fireplace. Alok didn't know what Klopp made, but soon, the soup boiled with a delicious smell that made his mouth water. Stirring skillfully with a paddle spoon, Klopp placed the cooked soup down on the table. Surprisingly, there was no burnt smell at all. If Alok was the one who did it, part of the food would be half burnt and the other part would be half cooked. Whenever he tried to cook some soup, for some reason, all the vegetables were likely to become mushy. Klopp went out, got some more firewood, and put it near the fireplace. He took the blanket and walked towards the bed. Alok quickly closed his eyes and pretended to be asleep. Soon, the warm coat was raised up. Alok shivered at the sudden coldness, and a blanket covered him. He had washed it, but the blanket was so dirty that there was still a faint scent of soap on the stains. The blanket was bigger and thicker than the coat, covering his cold toes, but somehow, he felt that the coat was warmer. Having finished all his business, Klopp left the cottage. Alok thought that he might be coming back, but the door didn't open even after a long time. Feeling disappointed with the reality that Klopp would no longer see him today, Alok lowered his blanket and rose to his feet. To think that he was feeling disappointed. Alok didn't know why he was being so fussy today. Perhaps it was because he was hungry. Holding his hungry stomach, he lifted himself up and walked to the table. When Klopp opened the lid of the pot, steam came out and it smelled very appetizing. Alok had calmed down a little while he was covered with the coat, but he still had a slight fever and a cold back, so Alok went to the kitchen wearing the blanket to bring a spoon. After contemplating for a moment whether to use his usual chair, Alok carefully climbed onto the chair where Klopp had been sitting earlier. And he brought the hot pot closer and ate the soup that was still hot. "This is delicious." It was so delicious that Alok blurted out the compliment without realizing it. He looked closely into the soup, but there wasn't any special ingredient in it. How did it become so different? Alok began to eat the soup in gulps. He had always eaten a small portion, but maybe because he had skipped his meal as he was sick, Alok ate the soup, sticking his nose into the pot, and devoured every drop until the bottom was exposed. As far as Alok could remember, he hadn't heard of Klopp being a good cook. He used to be in a boarding school, and even after he graduated and had a bit of a rough time, he still had lodging. He might have learned it when he was wandering after losing his wife and child. Just what had happened to him. However, there was no way for the current Alok to know. Even if he recalled his old memories of eating many rare and precious meals, he was so preoccupied with eating the very delicious soup that he definitely would give a thumbs up. Soon, he quickly forgot about all the other thoughts. Volume 1 Chapter 6.1. The first one. You are listening at novelfull.audio. When Alok first became pregnant with his first child, he wasn't surprised. His once proud family had already fallen on hard times and had to sell their estate, the epitome of Tywin's pride, after barely enduring a few years on their own. When he found out that the buyer was none other than Klopp, he didn't feel shocked or surprised. In fact, he thought his pregnancy was a good thing. After all, the father of his child was none other than Klopp Bandyke. It was quite unexpected, in a way. Even if he put aside his alpha status, he never imagined that Klopp would extend a hand to him, who had lost everything due to foolish judgment. While all his former friends and relatives ignored Alok's desperate letters, Klopp came to him when he had nowhere to go after selling his estate to pay off his debts. He offered to let Alok stay in the mansion. "Is there anything that you're good at?" "I'm good at things involving literature, music, or art." "That means you're good at nothing." Klopp had never looked at Alok warmly, but that time, his eyes had looked very eerie, like a truly bloodthirsty predator. It was as if he knew something. "It doesn't matter if you can't do anything useful. I have something else to do for you." "What's that?" "When the time comes, I'll let you know. Also, now that I'm the owner of this house, and you're a guest of mine, please be careful with your words." It was a fair demand, but it wasn't easy to be formal towards him immediately. After some hesitation, he replied, "I understand that well." Klopp really didn't ask him to do anything specific. Klopp was busy with various things, so he rarely stayed in the mansion. Klopp would leave early in the morning and return late at night. When Alok occasionally encountered him in the hallway, Klopp would walk past him making a small sneer but still treating him with impeccable manners. At first, Alok was very nervous and awkward facing Klopp. He wondered if Klopp might know something. However, Klopp only mocked the fall of the Tywin family and didn't indicate any other motives. Considering his naturally aristocratic demeanor and the fact that everyone had a certain amount of pretense for the sake of maintaining their status, it was possible that he had no ulterior motives. Alok, whose life was in utter despair, was so desperate that he could hardly suspect anyone. The days passed without anything happening. One day, Klopp, who returned early, found Alok in his study, lost in thought, reading his favorite classic. He held out a rather full paper envelope. "What is this item?" "From now on, 3 times a day, 2 pills each. Take 3 capsules before bed." "Pills? But I've not hurt anywhere." He looked up at him in wonder. His eyes were cold, and he hadn't even removed his coat yet. He took off his gloves one by one before he turned to Alok and mocked him. "You fully know that you're in no position to say that, Count. Just eat them as I say." Alok frowned at the sarcasm and opened the envelope, finding the pile of white pills. "Why, do they look like poison pills? Do I have to answer that?" He laughed lightly. But his deep eyes still glowed with a fierce intensity that still gave him an eerie feeling. Seeing Alok smile reflexively, Klopp explained in a light voice. "It's a new drug from a pharmaceutical company I recently invested in. They say it's amazing at enhancing pheromones. So I'm the test subject. Do you not want to?" Even if he didn't want to, he couldn't say yes to that. The pheromone pills sounded like some kind of tacky potion or erectile dysfunction treatment. Alok would have preferred to test poison pills, but it was clear that Klopp had chosen these drugs on purpose. Human testing of such a crude drug could be done on anyone wandering around looking for a mate, like a dog in heat. Perhaps Klopp wanted to humiliate Alok. Still holding the open book in his lap and the bag of pills, Alok looked up at Klopp. Alok tried to read if Klopp had any ulterior motives, but his expression remained unchanged. No one knew what had happened. Unless Alok spoke anything about it, it would just be remembered as an unfortunate accident. In all honesty, that was the truth too. "I understand. I will make sure to take them on time. I'm thankful for that, and please keep me posted on the progress." Information is important for investment. Beove with a satisfied smile, Klopp left the study. Alok grimaced at the mysterious pills before pushing them aside and browsing through the rest of the bookshelf. A few months later, Alok realized that the pills were extremely dangerous. Every night, his stomach hurt so much as if it were tearing apart, and his brain was spinning so much, making him dizzy. Even just taking the pills made him constantly nauseous, unable to swallow food, and later, he was even unable to properly vomit bile. He would get a fever, and he would groan and toss around all night. He would barely recover in the early morning hours, with a soaked body from sweat that required washing. Strong black tea was all he could force down his throat during breakfast, brought to him by the old butler, who was the only remaining Count's servant and still served Alok. He was losing weight rapidly. "You don't look well, my Count." "It's because I haven't slept well." "It's nothing to worry about," Alok replied to the concerned butler. He was a loyal servant, but he was also old and about to retire. Alok didn't want to make him worry when he couldn't even provide him with a generous retirement. Another person who knew about Alok's condition naturally inquired about him. "My stomach hurts so much at night that I can't even sleep, and my head is dizzy. I also feel nauseous. Investing in such pills seems like a big loss in the future." Alok was almost sarcastic because of the irritation caused by his body aches and lack of sleep. As if waiting for that response, Klopp lightly replied, "It's absurd to get a lecture from the Count on investments. At least I haven't lost my home." Unlike other things, talking about his estate made him feel offended. As Alok's brow furrowed and stayed silent, Klopp chuckled lightly and added, "Don't worry about it, those symptoms were expected. You're adjusting well, so I think it's better for you to increase your dosage. Take 3 pills at a time and 5 before bed." After giving that order, Klopp left again. He said it wasn't poison, but maybe it was. Maybe he intended to slowly dry him up and kill him. Perhaps he might even know the truth. Alok held his aching head inside. Later, he took 3 pills and had to lie in bed from the dizziness that made his vision spin since broad daylight. A few days into the dosage increase, he groaned and clutched his hurting lower abdomen as usual. When the sweat started to flow too much and soak the sheets, he had no choice but to get up despite his heavy body. He would have called for the maid in the past, but he couldn't now. Besides the butler, all the other employees were Klopp's men. He didn't want to entrust his body to strangers. Instead, he took the wet towel that the butler had brought into the room and wiped himself off. As he struggled to control his pounding head and lowered his legs under the bed to stand up, something hot trickled between his legs. He looked down in horror at the strange sensation of something unrecognizable running down his thighs and felt shivers down his spine. His light silk pajama pants were starting to get soaked red from top to bottom. What is this?" As Alok trembled in shock and reached out to touch the bloody fluid, something surged out from his opening along with stabbing pain, and it flowed down to soak his ankles and the carpet below. It was full of blood. "It's okay. Don't worry. Count, you will be fine soon. I have served the Count since he was born. Sir Alok has never bled before. We need to call a doctor. Don't do anything unnecessary, butler. In my house, you follow my orders. I am the Count's butler. This place isn't owned by the Count anymore. Don't be mistaken." Alok was still feeling too disoriented to open his eyes properly. The usually calm butler, in a rare burst of agitation, protested against the new owner of the house and was eventually dismissed. A few moments later, Alok could barely open his eyes and saw Klopp with a faint smile. "You've gained consciousness. What was that drug?" "Don't worry. You don't have to take them anymore in the future. I actually didn't expect you to listen to me so well. Is it because of your constitution?" Although Alok wanted to retort, he didn't have the energy, so he closed his eyes again and held it in. It was a clear sign that he didn't want any more confrontation. But Klopp continued to pace around the bed, seemingly unwilling to leave. His sensitive nerves were getting irritated, thus Alok opened his eyes again and glared at Klopp with all the strength he could muster. "I'd like for you to leave. I'll leave for today. There will be a lot for you to do in the future, so you can rest for now." Klopp told him to rest with a smirk on his face, but it was annoying that he was actually interrupting his rest. Alok furrowed his brow, closed his eyes again, and turned his body away. However, Klopp stayed there for a while longer before finally leaving the room when Alok's exhausted mind began to blur. The next morning, Alok still had a mild fever and painful bloody discharge, but he was in much better condition. He sat on the bed and waited for breakfast. Unlike usual, the breakfast was brought by a housekeeper he wasn't familiar with. She said her name was Martha. When Klopp entered the estate, he brought in a middle-aged female Omega who greeted Alok dryly and put the breakfast tray on the table instead of the bed. Alok asked her to bring it over, but she ignored him. He was infuriated by her rude behavior, given their clear status difference even if she was a maid who served a separate master. It was not right to vent his anger on someone else's poorly educated servant. He would clearly convey her rudeness to her owner. Alok got up from the bed and carefully moved his wobbly legs to sit on the chair. She didn't even bother to make tea and was about to leave. He wondered where the butler was and why he had to be treated like this. "Where is the butler? He has been dismissed early this dawn." "What?" Alok was surprised and inadvertently raised his voice. Martha, who was about to leave the place, was filled with a strong sense of disgust as she glared at Alok and said, "That was expected. The master has no wage to give to the servant." As soon as the long black skirt went through the door, it was immediately closed. Alok silently looked down at the cold teacup. He had just truly become an orphan. Volume 1 Chapter 6.2. The first one. You are listening at novelfull.audio. His body recovered quickly after he stopped taking the drug, but he still had fevers every night, which might be due to stress too. Alok was frantic, and his pajamas were uncomfortably wet when he woke up in the morning. He didn't know what that drug was, but it had a very unpleasant after-effect. As the fever subsided and the sweating decreased, a slippery substance was constantly secreted from his anus. It was like Omega's slick. Alok had to bite his lip in embarrassment when he looked at his wet pajama pants every morning. It was as if he had a leak. Especially when Martha, with her white and round face, sneered as she picked up the pajamas. It was unbearable, but he pretended not to notice. When he protested against the unilateral dismissal of the butler, Klopp said, "I don't need a uselessly expensive butler in my house." That was all he said. "Couldn't you at least have waited until you notify me first to let me write him a recommendation?" A recommendation from a fallen family would only be a hindrance. That was Klopp's reply when Alok staggered to find him in the study. He found him sitting behind a desk that was like an heirloom passed down from generation to generation by the Count of T-Wind. His attitude had now completely changed to arrogant. Alok didn't know what was making Klopp like this. However, every time he faced Klopp's domineering posture and entrapping gaze, his heartbeat and breathing became faster. Along with that, the after-effects also became even worse. Tired of the feeling of wetness in his pants, Alok couldn't protest anymore and turned away. "How is your body recently? Are you still having fevers?" "There is no problem." As he hurriedly walked away, the heat continued to leak out of him. It was very unpleasant and embarrassing at the same time. He didn't want anyone else to find out, and even if anyone did, he hoped it wasn't this guy. Just as he was about to turn the doorknob, Klopp suddenly stood right behind him and put his hand on Alok's shoulder. Surprised, he turned his body and violently swatted his hand away. The swinging hand accidentally grazed Klopp's firm jaw. Klopp also looked surprised and stared at Alok, eyes wide. "I apologize. I didn't mean to do that on purpose. You're very sensitive these days. Like an Omega in heat. I've felt it before, but even your scent seems to have changed." Already in a state of sensitive nerves due to his abnormal body, Alok could only retaliate with sarcasm, giving him a fierce glare. It's such a delusion to think I resemble him. It's so pathetic that it makes me tear up. At that moment, a large hand twisted Alok's neck. His blue eyes, shaking from earlier, relaxed their tension in shock. Into the dilating pupils, there was the piercing razor-sharp gaze of an enraged alpha, ready to kill at a moment's notice. If you dare to speak recklessly with your mouth, I'll have to sew your pretty lips using a needle stitch by stitch. It's better for you to be careful. I don't know why you hate me so much, but if you're being like this, it might be better for you to kick me out of here. I won't let you go away that easily, Alok T. Wind. There's a price that you need to pay for me. His heart sank. It was clear that Klopp knew about it. But how? I would kill you right now, but then it would only give you a peaceful rest. You have to suffer like me too. Don't you think so? A voice as cold as a winter snowstorm struck Alok's ears. He felt his blood freeze. When he looked up at the man with horror in his eyes, the man added emotionlessly with a laugh, as if he were a reaper holding a giant scythe to harvest his life, I was going to give you a few more days off, but now I won't. You should learn to keep your mouth shut in the future. He let go of Alok's neck and pushed him away. As Alok hit the door from the gust of wind, he watched the man's back as he walked back to his desk, saying, I'll come to find you tonight. Alok couldn't help but wonder why tonight, as slick from his anus trickled down to his ankles. Alok left the study, then he clutched his numb head in his hands. Something had gone terribly wrong. His body felt strangely aroused, and Klopp's voice echoed in his ears. This couldn't be happening. There couldn't be such a drug. It must be just the nasty side effects of some crude drugs. There was just no way. And more than anything, Klopp, of all people. He was thinking too much. Maybe he would come to give him another drug or to mock him. After how he had been treated earlier, Klopp might even try to hit him. Yes, that's it. That's probably what he'll do. Alok clutched his stomach, feeling sleepy, and headed for his room. Alok's expectations were half correct and half wrong. When Klopp showed up late at night and saw Alok, who couldn't sleep from being nervous, he violently pushed him onto the bed. When Alok tried to resist, Klopp slapped him. Alok's pale white noble skin, which had never been touched by any bruises before, was now marked with a hand-shaped bruise from just one slap. Horrified, Alok stared blankly at the man who was climbing on top of him, one hand holding his burning cheek. Klopp's cold, rake-like hands had already ripped off Alok's half-soaked pajama pants as if to tear them off. Repeatedly surprised, Alok stammered, "What are you doing, like a fool?" Klopp deftly spread Alok's pale legs, which he was trying to close. Klopp was holding them down with his knees and easily grabbed the two arms that were trying to push him away. His large hands grabbed both wrists at once and pinned them above Alok's head. Then he began to untie the waistband with his other hand. Alok couldn't stay silent. "I thought I'm an alpha. Didn't you say this is the trend? But, you refused me then. At that time, I had a family to protect, and now that I don't have a wife, there's no need for me to maintain fidelity. Then find another Omega. That's why I came to you." The moment Alok looked at him, who had a sneer on his face, his mind went dark. "You said, it was a drug for pheromone enhancement, that's right. It's for pheromone enhancement. But, only for Omega pheromones. That's impossible. There's no way that could happen." Klopp knew that if Alok was too surprised, he would lose his will to resist. Alok's body went limp, unable to even scream, and only mumbled quietly. Klopp's response was a cold sneer. "You shouldn't have just focused on noble hobbies like literature or art, you should have also paid attention to the latest scientific advances. Living like an outdated person, you'll eventually become a fossil, Count. Why on earth would you do that to me?" As Klopp was done undoing his belt and pants, He abruptly stopped and looked down at the person lying beneath him, who used to be an Alpha and was now an Omega. Then he grasped Alok's neck with a powerful grip like he could tear it straight away. "You took my wife and child away from me. You should return them to me, shouldn't you?" The extremely painful voice weakened enough to the point where he had to pause once in the middle. At the same time, Alok's heart also sank deep. He knew it. He knew everything. And he intended to take revenge on Alok. In the most pitiful and miserable way. In the cruelest way possible for Alok, who had only looked at Klopp until now. Read the NSFW content here. After all the things he had been through, it wasn't such a surprise when he found out about he was pregnant. He calmly accepted the fact. Atoning for an irreversible sin is not easy. Alok was grateful for the opportunity that Klopp had given him. It also gave Alok hope of regaining what he had lost. If the child was born safely, he would be Klopp's eldest child. If he was born as an Alpha, he would become the heir to the rising noble family of Bandike. Currently, Bandike had absorbed almost all of Tywin's wealth. In a way, Tywin had now belonged to Bandike. And the rightful heir of Tywin is also the rightful heir of Bandike. Although the surname would change, considering all the things that Alok had done, it would be fortunate if Tywin became a middle name. After giving birth, he wanted to bring back the butler who was kicked out without saying goodbye. The Tywin bloodline needed a butler who understood their elegant traditions, not a crude and ignorant housekeeper. Sitting at a table in the garden where the rich scent of the flowers wafted through the tattered petals, enjoying the sunshine, he touched his yet-to-be bloated belly and smiled a little. No matter how many children he had, the opportunity to find the butler would never come. It was too late now, and he was in no situation to find him. Seeing the skinny Alok, making a dry smile while dressed in rags that were a constant reminder of his sins, would only give a big shock to the housekeeper who practically raised him. Sometimes, he thought of the butler because he wanted to show him the angels he had given birth to. But there was no point in showing off his children to the butler when Alok himself couldn't even see their faces. Alok stroked his belly, obscurely believing that his third child was doing well inside. Volume 1 Chapter 7.1 I know you are listening at novelfull.audio. Regardless of the situation, Alok was currently raising Klopp's first child in his belly. It wasn't something to go out and brag about, but he also didn't think he needed to cower and hide about it. He also didn't have any acquaintances who would reach out to him to socialize now. The Alpha's attitude changed a bit now that he knew his Omega was pregnant. He didn't hit Alok and checked once a day to make sure he was safe. "You're a little late today." There were a lot of people rushing to me. There are quite a few people these days who are losing money on foolish investments, Klopp said as he handed his coat, hat, and gloves to Martha. Alok was sitting in the living room, reading a book with a blanket on his lap. He didn't have anything else to do, so he decided that he wanted to do a bit of prenatal care for the child. Right now, he was engrossed in reading the works of ancient philosophers. Getting immersed in the classics that required a few minutes per line to ponder, time passed quickly, and above all, his heart felt at ease. At first, he would play the piano or violin at the music hall, but now his belly had grown too big, and he couldn't sit at the piano or stand for too long because his legs hurt. There was a piece that he wanted to hear, but it didn't seem like Klopp would allow him to go out, and Klopp didn't seem willing to invite a performer too, so Alok just held it back. "How was your day?" Just as Alok wanted to speak up after flipping his book, Martha, who was putting away Klopp's coat, spoke first. "He had been eating well and exercising. The baby is growing well. Other than that, he spent the whole day sitting and reading. The baby must be smart." As they exchanged conversation as if gossiping about themselves, Alok glanced at them with a stern expression before returning his gaze to his book. Alok thought Klopp would leave soon, but instead, he sat down on the couch across from him. "What are you reading?" Of all books, why did he pick this one today? And why did Klopp ask something he usually wouldn't? Alok didn't deliberately avoid eye contact, but he didn't think he needed to see the other man's sneer. As he was in the middle of reading a book. What does the book say? What form of sin is it when a pervert who lusts after the same alpha instigates a pregnant omega to his death? The fingers gripping the book became white with tension. The pages he was about to turn creaked. The crimes discussed in this book are not related to actual criminal law, but rather philosophical and moral sins that should not be committed as social leaders. I see. That's why you could commit such a sin without a conscience. You've never been taught about it. Wouldn't it be better for you to read before reading that? It would teach you the basics that you need to have as a human being. Hearing those words, Alok raised his eyes and looked at Klopp. His tone was sarcastic, but his expression was serious. He was tired of the hatred and condemnation pouring out without the slightest pretense. Alok sighed softly and closed his book. I'll take note of that. He stood up, leaving to sleep first. And Klopp did not stop him. The usual bedtime routine done by the butler was now taken over by Martha, who had a displeased face. She was Klopp's right-hand woman, in charge of everything in the estate, where there was no butler. I wish I could have some warm tea before bed. Tea is not good for the baby. It is not good for the baby either if the expecting mother is unhappy. At those words, Martha, who was tidying the bed, glared at him fiercely. She quickly approached and roughly took off Alok's clothes and dressed him in a white nightgown. Her hands were rough like a stern nanny dealing with a naughty child. She forcibly pushed Alok onto the bed. Being forcefully pushed to the bed, he tried to reach for a book that he hadn't finished reading on the table, but Martha hit the back of his hand painfully. What do you think you're doing? I can't allow you to stay up any later than this. Sleep is essential for the baby's growth. He was an adult and of higher status than her, and on top of that, he was pregnant with her master's child. He felt offended by her harsh words. Even as Klopp's housekeeper, you're being out of line. Is your master aware of your rudeness? He didn't like to directly say he disliked a servant, but he had no choice since Martha was unmanageable. Despite Alok's scolding, she continued to spit harsh words. My master is probably unaware of it, as he is rotting in the ground with his unborn child. So don't try to act like you're my master under the excuse of your petty pregnancy. Oh. Martha was probably Raphael's servant. Now he understood why the middle-aged Omega was so ferocious. She would probably be this mean to Alok for the rest of her life. Martha turned off the light and left without asked. He couldn't sleep, so he lay in the dark room and stared blankly at the dark ceiling. Alok decided that he would have to send her away when he gave birth. No matter what, the servant of his deceased ex-wife would not be good for the baby's emotional development. He wrapped his round belly and closed his eyes, thinking about how to persuade Klopp for the baby. Martha, who had revealed her true colors, often made Alok miserable. At first, he wanted to let it go, but later, she crossed the line too much. She made him eat all the leftover meal that didn't suit Alok's taste. Some people can't eat this, even if they want to. If you don't finish everything, I will inform the master. I don't like fish. Give it to someone else who wants to eat it. I'm telling you to eat it for the child, not for yourself. It's a generational tradition from the paternal side of the family to have the pregnant woman eat fish. As soon as he heard the word, you, Alok raised his head and glared at Martha. He couldn't hear the rest of her words because of the shocking vocabulary. No matter how low he had fallen, a commoner shouldn't use such language toward a noble. Alok couldn't bear the rising anger and shame, and he spoke in a stern voice with a slightly reddened face. Once I give birth to my child, I'll kick you out. Martha snorted at those words. Who's talking about whom? As the biological mother of the child who will inherit the Viscount estate, I can no longer tolerate your rudeness. Then do you think one can tolerate a pathetic, selfish person who killed a kind master and his baby, yet still complains about food? The frank reproach stung him. Alok's mouth hung open. For a moment, he was stunned by her unsophisticated and crude language. Alok let out his anger, which rarely happened. Get out right away. Your vulgar language is rotting my ears. I don't want to breathe the same air as something who's not even human too. She cursed until the end, and Alok's hands on the chair trembled due to the shock. He couldn't bear the sudden rush of fatigue and went to bed early. Late at night, he heard the voices of Klopp and Martha through the crack of the door. Alok covered his ears with his hands. From the next day on, fish was added to all his meals. Oh no, it's fish. A piece of smoked red-fleshed fish fillet came in the grocery basket in front of the cabin today. It was nicely trimmed for eating, seasoned with bay leaves and whole peppercorns, and wrapped in clean paper. Judging by the skillful work, it was probably done by Martha. Fish was always the hardest food to get on the street. Even though he had eaten fish countless times before, he couldn't remember what it tasted like. He thought for a moment about what to do with it, then he unwrapped it and put it in a rustic pot, then he threw it into the fire pit, which was still burning. It was fish, so he figured he could just roast it. Soon a delicious aroma wafted through the air, and without realizing it, his mouth watered. He opened the hot pot to reveal juicy and delicious roasted meat. Alok picked up his fork and took a piece of perfectly cooked meat. Carefully putting it in his mouth, the meat melted on the tip of his tongue. Suddenly, he was overwhelmed with hunger. It's delicious. Don't you think so too? As if answering his question, the baby in his stomach gave a weak kick in response. Laughter burst out of him. It seemed like the father's love for fish was genetically passed to the baby. Yielding to the baby's urging a few more times, Alok happily tore into the hot flesh, blowing on it to cool it down. After eating fish for the first time in a long time, he felt drowsy after the full meal. The baby seemed satisfied and slept without any more movements. He hadn't seen Klopp yet today, so he tried to wait it out, but his heavy eyelids kept closing, and darkness crept in. Unable to hold out any longer, Alok ended up sitting at the foot of the bed, only his upper body resting on the bed, and fell deeply asleep. Volume 1 Chapter 7.2 I know you are listening at novelfull.audio. The first labor was full of dread. Alok couldn't lie in bed and clung to the couch cushion like a castaway clinging to a single rotting plank in the open sea. He buried his face in the fluffy cotton, screaming his whole life's portion of screams. Endure it. Just what is so painful? He couldn't even hear the harsh voice. Alok's mind was hazy, he felt like his lower body was being ripped apart, and he wished someone would cut him open with a knife right away. Soon, the doctor came in. Tears pooled in his eyes, but he didn't shed any. Instead, his cold sweat, runny nose, and drool made a mess on his face. The cervix is still far from opening. It hurts so much. Please save me. Alok didn't care about his pride and begged the doctor. The doctor raised his damp sleeves and awkwardly laughed. You can't be acting like you're dying when it's only this much. It will hurt many times worse when the pelvis starts to contract properly later. Please endure it. As it's your first labor, it's going to take a lot of time. Take deep breaths. Inhale and exhale like this. It'll be tough because your pelvis is small. The doctor's deep breathing method helped a little, but then came the intense pain, and Alok screamed at the top of his lungs, tearing at the cushion, not even able to breathe. He couldn't understand why he had to suffer such pain. He was an alpha. He used to be an alpha. Why did he have to become an omega and writhe in pain like his body was torn in half? Guilt and atonement were nothing in the face of excruciating pain. He just felt resentful. He was extremely resentful of the man outside the door who was watching this way and having a serious conversation with the doctor. He knew exactly what Klopp's intentions of impregnating him were. Upon seeing the fake worried expression on his face that he put on in front of the doctor, Alok gritted his teeth so hard that his jaw trembled. He didn't want to show tears here. Enduring this much pain was enough. He didn't want to increase the other person's satisfaction by shedding useless and sentimental tears. Ayok. Ugh. Ah. He exhaled deeply, burying his face in the already damp cushion. Alok had been in labor all morning and had finally given birth to a baby boy at sunset. He was so exhausted that he couldn't even blink, holding onto the torn cushion while breathing shallowly. In the midst of that, he heard Klop's voice in his ringing ears. The baby boy is an Omega with blonde hair. Congratulations, Viscount. Martha, take the baby to the room. Where are they taking him? Show him to me. I spent 9 months growing and giving birth to the baby while breaking my pelvis. Alok screamed, but no one seemed to hear him. In his blurred vision, a tall man appeared. He's not dead, right? He was just exhausted. He did lose a lot of blood, but it's nothing dangerous. However, since his body went through a lot of stress, I would recommend that you use contraception in the future. That's none of your business. The doctor didn't argue anymore after he was cut off. Other people soon came and lifted the collapsed Alok and took him somewhere. He couldn't remember much because he passed out on the way. But when he opened his eyes again, feeling like his body was going to break apart, he was in a shabby cabin that he had never seen before. Alok couldn't understand what was going on and thought it was a dream. Then he lost consciousness again. The beginning of a brutal reality set in as he fell into a deep sleep. True vengeance awaited him. At first, he couldn't believe it. How could they confine an Omega who had just given birth to his child in such a filthy, barren place? It was a dusty room full of dirty wooden beds, where no light could even enter. Alok, still unable to walk properly, dragged his aching body out of the cabin. He could see the estate in the distance. He walked, wrapping his still strong belly with one hand and supporting himself with a tree branch or anything he could grab with the other. Occasionally, something hot trickled between his legs, and he knew it was blood without looking at it. He walked barefoot without shoes, stepping on the thorny, painful gravel until he reached the rose garden. From here, he thought Klop would be able to see him. In the distance, through the bright window, he could see Martha holding a baby wrapped in a long lace. Her face was beaming with joy as if the baby were her own grandson. Next to her, Klop smiled softly while looking down at the newborn baby. Then, he looked up and met Alok's eyes. His gentle smile disappeared, and a cold sneer appeared on his face. He opened the large window that also served as a balcony and stepped, soon facing Alok. Can you walk already? Oh my, you're bleeding. It hurts. And I'm cold, BVEC, of course, that's because you're walking around in those thin clothes. If you're cold, go back and light a fire. If it hurts, take the painkillers I brought. Even a stranger wouldn't act so indifferent. Unable to support his trembling knees, Alok grabbed Klop's arm wrapped in an expensive shirt. He grunted a little, but instead of pushing him away, Klop supported his elbow with his hand. Why do I have to be there? What about the baby? Don't worry about the baby. And now, that place is yours. If you don't like it, you can leave. He couldn't understand what Klop was saying. No, he didn't want to understand. Alok held on to the shirt he had in his hand. I've given birth to your child. You returned one of the things you took from me. Still, my first child that I lost won't come back. You asked to have your wife and child returned to you. So, the dark brown eyes looked down at Alok with an emotionless gaze. So what? Are you saying you want to play the role of my wife now that you've given birth to my child? Ah. At that moment, Alok didn't know how to react. He wasn't offering to become a replacement for Raphael. He simply thought that, as the biological mother of the child, he had the responsibility and authority to take care of the child. I'll raise the child well on my own, so don't worry. I don't plan on raising him to be a criminal who would shamelessly walk around even after committing crimes. But, I've told you that you can leave if you don't like it. I hope you don't show up in front of the estate in that filthy state again in the future. What was it again? Ah, it damages the reputation of a nobleman to have neglected acquaintances. I have to be more careful of my reputation now, so will you help me with that? I'll send the fish prepared for you so you won't hurt your fingers. Looking at the cruel man who only chose the most hurtful words even without any profanities, Alok felt the world plunge into darkness. And everything sank down, and further down. Was this revenge? Had he been keeping his head down and waiting for this opportunity all this time? So that he would wander forever in this dark abyss. He lost his property, his family, his people, and his child too. He was only left with himself. If he had his everything taken away, he would have rather lived in eternal oblivion. Because Alok didn't receive that final thing, it was even more cruel revenge. Lying on the hard bed that only hurt his body, Alok decided to give up on his final moments. He ate nothing and drank nothing. He didn't have the strength nor the will to do so. No one came to visit him in this quiet cabin. It would be a lonely death. But the silence even masked that loneliness. As there was truly nothing left, peace came easily. Besides, his body, which had lost all its will to live, quickly withered. A day, 2 days. Although it didn't seem like much time had passed, he could feel his breathing becoming weaker and his heartbeat slowing down. He had already given up on his sight, but his hearing, which was functioning on its own, gradually lost strength and brought silence. To just disappear like this felt like the most appropriate ending. Alok felt his life evaporating until the last drop dried up, and then he felt his body rising up. He read before in the testimony of a certain preacher, called, that death was comparable to a gust of wind. People would float like bubbles, pushed by the breath of God, through bright skies or deep underground, until they reached their final destination, be it a shining sky or a dark underground. That's right, he was floating right now. But why was it so warm? The preacher did not leave any record of death being warm. In his blurry vision, he saw a grim reaper carrying dearly the dirty soul with his 2 arms. He had dark auburn hair and a tough-looking face, with unwavering eyes that could pierce through a person. Some called the Grim Reaper a terrifying god, but at least to Alok, he was a very kind and gentle god. That's why the god appeared in that guy's appearance at the end. If he was indeed the Grim Reaper, Alok could tell him all the things that he wanted to say. Alok moved his arm, which he couldn't feel properly, and embraced the Grim Reaper's neck. Then he buried his nose in his strong shoulder and smelled his scent. Clop. I've always thought of you as my alpha. I had been through a lot of pain and suffering, but I was glad to be your omega. You wouldn't like for me to end it like this. There was no helping it since it was the price I had to pay for my foolishness. If there was a next time, then that time, I would. There won't be a next time. Your sin is too great to just die like this. The Grim Reaper's voice was so cold that it could freeze the air. Even until the very end, his heart remained cold. Ugh! Alok gasped for breath and opened his eyes. Just moments ago, he was dying alone after giving birth to a child. He quickly put his hand on his belly. He felt something large and taut. As he looked up through the open window, he saw a sliver of blue sky. It was still a bright afternoon. Ah, it seemed like he had been dreaming. He had probably dreamed such a nightmare because of his lying position on the bed. Alok gathered his cramped joints and lightly patted them with his fist. Every time he gave birth, he would remember the pain of the first time. At that time, he was healthier than now, but his belly had ached more. And the despair was greater because he had hope. Enough that he even attempted suicide. He feared most of what would happen after that. Clop never forgave him for trying to die so easily. Even after that, he tried to die once again, but he was always saved by Clop. It would be useless to try again now, and he didn't even want to die anymore. If he continued to sit on the floor like this, it might make his water break at the wrong time. To change his mood, he got up and went out of the cabin. He could see the rose garden and the mansion. Alok smiled and was thankful for the unchanging scenery. He recalled the last words of the preacher, who said that only by abandoning many things can one find the way to paradise. This place was no longer the abyss. The person currently here was not Count T-Wind, but Alok. Klopp's Omega. With his light body that didn't have anything, he was already carried by the breeze to paradise. The time he spent with his baby waiting for his alpha to come was full of delight. Make me feel happy and supported by leaving a comment. Volume 1 Chapter 8.1. Blue-blooded. You are listening at novelfull.audio. This time, Alok would really have nowhere to go if he got abandoned again. He tried not to be arrogant like he was during his second pregnancy. He didn't lash out at the servants who brought him meals, nor did he starve himself. He tried to live quietly and obediently as much as he could. But it wasn't easy at all to do things he had never done before in his life. He cut his fingers too many times while peeling potatoes, so the soup ended up boiling with his blood. He tore his clothes to shreds while doing laundry. It took him all day to light the fire pit in the kitchen, and sometimes he bumped his head while cleaning and got a bruise. Nevertheless, he still managed to do it. Klopp came once a day. He looked around the cabin without saying any words and checked if Alok was okay. While Klopp was checking if the Omega he owned stayed safe overnight, Alok was too nervous to say anything and just stood there observing Klopp too. Klopp always looked like a hero from northern mythology. He looked like an intellect in his reserved clothing but still looked strong like an alpha, and he could embrace him passionately when he went into heat. After everything that happened, sometimes Alok would get scared and sad, but he was still happy. Sometimes when their eyes met, Alok awkwardly smiled. Then Klopp frowned as if he was offended and glared at him. You really have no self-esteem. Alok already knew what Klopp was going to call him without hearing it. There was a time when Alok was full of jealousy that he outrightly insulted Klopp, saying that if he had no self-esteem, he was not human but a bug. There was the time when Alok had tried to berate his beloved wife, and Klopp, who was his fiancée then, had stepped in, so Alok had berated him instead. Klopp remembered all of that. He must have a really good memory. Alok just smiled. Read the NSFW content here. Alok woke up late the next day and looked at his unsurprising empty side. He had opened his eyes a while ago but hadn't gotten up, so he brushed off the crumpled sheet under his heavy weight. Pregnancy was not bad. In fact, it was good because Klopp would come often. But on the other hand, he was afraid. Giving birth always hurt, and he had to let go of the baby without even saying goodbye. He tightly hugged the blanket, which still had the alpha's residual scent, and took a deep breath. After a while, he got up from the bed. He was so hungry that the baby was probably upset and kicked his belly loudly. Wait a little bit. You need to have some patience. There would probably be 2 roasted potatoes left from last night. He should eat them before they go bad. As he tried to stand up with both legs, he fell back down under the bed. His legs gave out, there wasn't any strength left in them. He landed on his buttocks painfully, and his belly hurt too. The baby must have been surprised too. The kicking stopped. Alok groaned and stood up again. At that moment, something hot ran between his thighs. His face became red at the sight of the slightly bloody, sticky substance. He could smell the alpha's scent mixed with his own scent through the pungent smell. He wiped between his legs with an old cloth that served as a towel, rubbing his suddenly flushed face. Then he started eating the potatoes he took out of the fire pit. They taste really good today. Don't you think so? The child moved in a hectic as if responding to the question. Alok laughed out loud without realizing it. He washed with water drawn from the manual pump. It was regretful to lose Klopp's scent, but if he didn't wash up, his stomach would hurt later. After washing, he suddenly felt tired and feverish from the remaining effects of his heat, so he climbed into the bed and lay down. Clop's scent still lingered on the sheets. Alok felt lucky. With his cheek lightly resting on the sheet, he closed his eyes and fell asleep. As the pregnancy progressed, he only felt an increase in fatigue and sleepiness. When Clop dropped by unannounced, Alok mentioned this fact to him. That his body felt strangely heavy and he kept falling asleep. Even when he had been through enough pregnancies previously, this time felt a bit abnormal, he said with a slight laugh. It was just something he said to dispel the awkward atmosphere that had arisen from their previous intercourse, but it didn't seem to work. Clop looked at him with a twisted voice, and Alok felt embarrassed. Clop looked his way without much response. "What do you want this time, Count?" Clop asked with a twisted voice, making Alok feel embarrassed. He felt like he was acting out again. He quickly shook his head, fearing that he would receive another chastise that began with, "You really dare to not know your place." "I don't want anything. I just wanted to mention it. I'm satisfied now as it is." His dark auburn eyes flickered with interest, but when Alok smiled, they quickly turned into displeasure. He despised Alok's smile so much. But Alok always unconsciously smiled, and the air always became cold. It just couldn't be helped. Occasionally, Clop would stare at him absent-mindedly. But he didn't say anything. When he looked at him like that, Alok didn't know how he should respond, so he just sat still with a thin smile, staring back at him. Sometimes, almost imperceptible, Clop would return a momentary smile. When that happened, Alok felt his heart pounding. His fingertips trembled, so he deliberately grabbed the hem of his shirt and crumpled it. He wanted to keep looking at that smile, but he didn't want Clop to notice his blushing cheeks, so he deliberately turned his head away. "I am the one who feels uncomfortable." Clop stood up, leaving incomprehensible words behind, and left without further actions. He could have stayed a little longer. Left alone, Alok found himself wondering what to do in the center of the cabin that had suddenly turned into winter. He wiggled his frozen toes for a bit, then stood up and walked aimlessly around the empty space. He grabbed a potato on the table and put it down, then wiped the back of an empty chair that Clop had forgotten to push back in place. And he caught a glimpse of himself in the dusty mirror hanging on the wall. His unruly hair had grown quite long. The hair that he had cut short when he last came back to the cabin was now long enough to reach his shoulders. His once golden and lustrous hair was now dull and ugly. As he glanced at his face, he noticed that his cheeks had sunken in, and his eyes had lost their sparkle. Alok smiled faintly without any hint of arrogance. He felt awkward looking at his own reflection, but he also felt somewhat familiar with it. After a while, he realized who the person in the mirror looked like. "Ah! That smile Clop made wasn't directed at me." His chest ached. Volume 1 Chapter 8.2 Blue-Blooded. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Time passed and it was time to give birth to his third child. The midwife who had helped with the previous labors came. Unlike the first two, this baby was delivered in the cabin. The pain was so unbearable, it made him feel like he was going to die. The midwife immediately cut the umbilical cord and wrapped the baby in a soft cloth even before the baby could let out the first cry. Alok had gotten used to it by now in his third pregnancy. He just watched the baby with his tired body. The midwife handed the baby to his father who was waiting outside. This was their third child and the second Omega child. The baby was also Clop's first daughter. Clop was ecstatic and smiled in joy. Alok looked at the baby with his numb body and found himself smiling unconsciously looking at the scene. Clop, who had left a soft kiss on the small, round, and red baby head, turned his head towards Alok. Clop smiled a little wider when he saw Alok's crinkled smile, which was now familiar to him that it felt almost welcoming. "Good work." Alok's eyes blinked. The greeting was so unexpected that he wanted to react more enthusiastically, but his body wouldn't listen. In the blink of an eye, Klopp's eyes darted in Alok's direction before he turned back and took the baby away. Alok hadn't expected to be able to see the baby anyway, but he still felt sad every time he watched Klopp's back walking away. Omega son, Alpha son, and Omega daughter. Alok already had 3 children, but he never knew their names. Even if it's a fallen family, it would be nice to give at least one of them the middle name of T-Wind. But that probably wouldn't happen. Alok closed his eyes, fatigued. Unlike before, the midwife at least showed some sincerity this time by changing the dirty sheets. With the help of the rather not gentle midwife, Alok had a wash and lay down in bed. Painkillers and water were placed next to his bedside. It wasn't like this before, but now, he couldn't endure the pain without taking the medicine. The midwife roughly cleared the messy floor and left without saying any greeting. After that, Alok was left alone, overwhelmed and trembling with anxiety. He was afraid that when he opened his eyes again, he would see the cold stone floor. His eyelids were dropping, but he couldn't stop himself from opening his eyes again and again. Grunting, Alok soon lost his focus and passed out. After some time, when he realized that he was sleeping, he was startled and opened his eyes in surprise. He let out a deep relief when he saw the familiar cabin ceiling. For a moment, he felt he was about to cry, but it only reached his throat and subsided. Something hot burned and kept flowing down his throat. Klopp's visits abruptly stopped the day after he gave birth. He must be busy raising the baby. He would also have a lot of work as a promising economic bureaucrat. There was no need for him to come here. Alok brainwashed himself to avoid feeling disappointed and immersed himself in various chores in the cabin. He was now quite skilled at peeling potatoes. He also became better at sewing. He learned how to tend the flower garden in front of the cabin and how to clean the fireplace. It was better to be caught up in various tasks so that he didn't have to think about anything else. He cleaned the soot-covered fireplace and scraped off all the ashes, dumping them in the flower garden. He fetched water from the well and scrubbed the dusty cabin clean. This time, he was even skilled enough to wash the quilts separately. While mending his torn clothes, Alok looked out the window. Sometimes, when it rained, listening to the beautiful sound of raindrops falling made the day go by quickly. As he became more proficient at housework, he had more time to spare. He was too free. He thought it would be nice if he had books or instruments, but then he realized he had a lot of time on his hands, so he could try making them himself. At the thought of producing something, his gloomy mood suddenly became lifted. Let's see. With what I have now, I can't make a violin or an oboe. A piano is impossible. If I had a pen and paper, I could at least write something. Using blood as ink on bed sheets is too much. I guess, there's only that one possible option. It's difficult to do it alone, but not impossible. He went outside and picked several pebbles of similar size. He carefully marked the patterns on them with charcoal from the fire pit, then drew a grid on the tabletop. He created a somewhat lacking, but still well-formed chessboard. It's simple, isn't it? Unconsciously, he spoke to the baby while stroking his belly with his hand. But his belly was now flat, all belly fat had already disappeared for some time. He put his hands on the table in disappointment. But that didn't continue for long. Alok was soon lost in the game of chess. Playing shadow chess against his own self was quite a difficult game. He had to concentrate hard, and he could be immersed in it all day. It was purely a delight that he hadn't felt in a long time. Alok was quite skilled at chess. It was a little painful to use his head, which had been unused for a while, but it had been so long since he last enjoyed playing games, it made him hum songs. Occasionally, he would gesture the violin fingerings in the air while thinking about his next move. Alok Tuind, you're quite strong. You can't get defeated easily. That's as expected. However, don't forget that I received lessons from a chess champion. Out of habit, he continued to talk to himself. There was no one listening, so he didn't feel embarrassed. Envy. After giving birth to 3 children, his facial skin felt thicker, but it didn't matter. He had no appearance or obligation to maintain anymore. So this would be fine. Then he boldly lay face down on the table. It was an act of rebellion he had never done before, as he always kept his back and shoulders straight with his head high. He laughed heartily even though the chess pieces were disrupted. He buried his face in his arms and laughed. When he looked up, he met Klopp's eyes looking at him from across the room. He looked at Alok, who was frozen, still with a bright expression, his haphazard chessboard and pebble pieces next to him. Klopp uttered something at him. Do you even have a heart? When and what do you have to experience so that you get hurt and cry miserably? Alok was very puzzled. And he didn't understand. What do you have to experience to get hurt? Wasn't that something Klopp himself knew best? He had been reduced to rags in every way imaginable, physically and mentally, even spiritually. He almost thought he had paid all the price of his previous sins. When his family fell apart and he became pregnant as an Omega, he had already lost his pride. Many times, he had felt so miserable and hurt that he couldn't even believe his reality. He sold himself for a piece of bread and felt he was so miserable that he almost went crazy. There was also a time when he even thought of giving up everything as there was no hope. Seeing Klopp, who was showing frustration, Alok collected his smile and spoke up. I've been hurt too. How? When you are just laughing with so much joy. My wife was crying in despair, he is slowly rotting away in the ground, but why are you having fun laughing and playing? Alok was even more bewildered by his words. Did Klopp want him to just stare blankly into the air? He didn't know what to say, so he just looked around the room and lightly clenched his hands. If you don't want me to play chess, I won't play it. It's not about playing chess. Do you even have a heart? Do you even have a beating heart inside your chest? How can you laugh like that even when you live such a miserable life after getting your children taken away? Were you just tricking me into sympathy when you jumped into the river? Alok froze up. In a flash, Klopp closed the distance between them and grabbed Alok's neck, growling. Alok was at a loss for words. I wasn't tricking you. I really wanted to die at that moment. No matter what he said, Klopp didn't listen. Alok could see himself stunned in Klopp's eyes which were blazing with intense anger. Alok unconsciously relaxed his face. At that moment, Klopp sneered with disgust. You always look down on people with that arrogant smile of yours. You're such a noble aristocrat. You're just like a blue-blooded demon who doesn't shed any tears at any moment. He wasn't smiling because he wanted to. It was just an unconscious act as a way to suppress his emotions which he couldn't control. But Klopp didn't see it that way. As the successor to a prestigious count, Alok was trained from a very young age to embody the nobility to his very bones. He always held his head high, never displayed excessive emotions, and always wore a faint smile. Crying was also strictly forbidden. It was as natural as breathing, eating, and sleeping. It didn't carry any significant meaning, it was simply tradition and manners. Because of that, the nobles were sometimes called emotionless, cold-blooded demons among the commoners. But Alok hadn't thought that Klopp, who was also a noble, would criticize him for it. He and Raphael faithfully expressed their emotions to each other, unlike nobles. Instead of being sophisticated and indirect, no matter what others said, they confessed their honest love straightforwardly. Even when people were watching, the lovers often whispered to each other as commoners do. It made the two lovers look very adorable, and they made the nobles who had unrequited love jealous. Even when Alok swallowed his pride and used the Alpha and Omega trend as an excuse to ask Klopp to sleep with him for just one night, Klopp didn't respond like a noble would. Instead, Klopp was baffled and became serious. Save your decadent and corrupted behavior in your sense-mingled estate that makes one's nose rotten. You're just like a pig in heat. After throwing that insult, he went to find Raphael. There were other nobles watching them, and Alok's dignity fell to the ground. But even then, Alok just smiled faintly and left the room with a pale face. Even now, he could do nothing but laugh. However, Klopp's expression became increasingly hostile, and it seemed like he would lash out at him soon. Unable to make any resistance while being grabbed by the neck, Alok asked in a weak voice, trembling slightly. "Do you want me to cry?" "What? If I cry and show my tears, will you realize that I'm in pain too?" When Alok asked that, Klopp laughed out loud, showing his teeth. He sneered at Alok, saying, "How dare you speak of pain from your own mouth," and eventually let out a cold chuckle and sarcasm. "You can try it. When you didn't even cry while giving birth." Just looking at Klopp made Alok's heart ache so much that he felt something rising in his throat. His eyes became hot, but no matter how long he waited, tears did not come. Instead, his face contorted, and he tried to make a sobbing sound, but in the end, no tears came out. He was in despair. "You're really toying with people until the end. You fucking demon." Leaving those harsh words, Klopp shrugged off Alok's neck and swept away the pebbles Alok had collected. He turned away and left with a cold glare. For the rest of the afternoon, Alok didn't pick up the scattered pebbles. He only tried to shed a tear. Strangely, no tears came out. Why don't tears flow when my heart was in so much pain? Later, he poked his own eyes to force out his physiological tears before a few drops could finally fall. He didn't know what was wrong with himself. Why didn't tears come out? If someone felt sad or hurt, tears should have fallen naturally. Until now, he thought he was holding his tears back. Even when his eyes became hot, he thought he was forcibly swallowing them back down his throat. Now he realized he wasn't holding his tears back, but he lost his ability to tear up altogether. Perhaps his tear ducts had broken down due to neglect. Even when he was in so much despair that he wanted to die, he didn't shed any tears. Just as Klopp had said, for someone who didn't cry even when he was in the excruciating pain of giving birth like his bones were being stretched alive, how would he be able to cry now? He tried his best, but he ultimately failed. Was this a sign that he was becoming a blue-blooded demon? He couldn't know for sure. Make me feel happy and supported by leaving a comment. Volume 1 Chapter 9.1. Not this time. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Klopp's visits had become less frequent. His daily life passed idly. Now that he couldn't play chess anymore, he immersed himself in gardening. He felt like Klopp would be angry if he saw this too, but he couldn't bear not having something to occupy himself with. Every morning, Alok woke up and took painkillers while recollecting memories of the few gardening books that he had read before. Following what he remembered from the book, he transplanted flowers that bloomed in abundance nearby and also collected some seeds. He trimmed branches and occasionally picked flowers, putting them in a bucket, to decorate the cabin. The yellow daffodils and colorful tulips scattered around the cabin were originally planted by Alok's mother. Although he could barely remember her now, he remembered that his mother's hobby was gardening, and she had skills comparable to an expert. The estate's pride and joy, the rose garden, was once unremarkable, but her mother made it so colorful and beautiful. His mother had bought all kinds of rare rose seedlings and decorated the garden sophisticatedly. The garden was most beautiful in early summer, that's why his father always invited people over for tea parties in early summer. Although it was also out of his aristocratic obligation, it was probably also with the purpose of showing off his mother's rose garden. Someday, Alok hoped to visit the garden again, in the early summer when thousands of roses bloomed in different colors. It was the only trace of his mother left for Alok. One day, as he was going about his day as usual, Alok suddenly heard a child's voice. Alok had just transplanted the daffodils when he raised his head up and heard the sound of tiny footsteps across the cypress trees. He also heard a burst of high-pitched laughter. He stood up and fixed his gaze on the small creature that seemed to be the source of the sound. After a moment, a child suddenly appeared from the cypress tree path leading to the cabin. The child looked to be about 4 years old, and his blonde hair was sparkling in the sunlight. His pale face was as pretty as a doll crafted by a skilled artisan. Most of all, his eyes, more clear and blue than the sky, were extremely lovely. The child was surprised when he saw Alok and froze in his tracks, staring at him with wide eyes. Without any words, Alok knew at that moment. The child was his firstborn. The Omega boy, born to Alok. Suddenly, his heart started beating loudly. He felt like he should say something, but he had no idea what to say. Alok stiffened up, then without even realizing it, he smiled. The child saw it and responded with a smile of his own. He saw a smile from the most beautiful flower ever in the world. He thought he would really get killed this time if Klop found out, but Alok couldn't resist approaching the child and touching him. The child, who seemed to be raised well with love, was very healthy and exuded confidence. When Alok grasped the child's shoulders with his trembling hands, the child did not seem afraid at all. Alok was so surprised that he didn't even think to put down the yellow daffodil he was holding. The child reached out with his small hand and took the flower. What's your name?" he asked in a shaky voice as he handed him the daffodil, and the child giggled in amusement. Just as those cherry dot-like lips were about to open, Alok heard an urgent male voice calling out from the other side, "Raphael. Daddy." The child, Raphael, quickly turned back and ran. Klop appeared from behind a huge tree, like a parent who had lost their child and was rushing to find them. Klop ran over and picked up Raphael's small body in his arms. It was the first time Alok had seen him look so worried. Klop ran his hands over Raphael's tiny hands and legs to make sure he was okay, then he took a deep sigh of relief and kissed his forehead. He then looked at his son with a slightly stern gaze. "What were you doing here?" Despite the stern words, Raphael did not cower. "I met him. He gave me this." Raphael pointed at Alok with a bright expression and then held out the daffodil he was holding. Alok kept staring blankly at Raphael. This was the first time he had seen him from this close, so he wanted to remember every detail. But the child's other parent didn't seem to feel the same way. With the little blonde boy in his arms, Klop was about to leave. Alok quickly called out to him. "Excuse me, Klop. I'll talk to you later." The familiar cold response came back. But the look in his eyes was a little strange. Recently, he had been full of sneers and disgust, but now he glared at Alok with a newfound fury. Alok couldn't find words to say anymore. Soon, Klop turned his body and blocked his son's gaze, then took him away quickly. Alok continued to follow them as far as he was allowed with quick steps, trying to catch a glimpse of the blonde hair a little longer. The child, who was being held by his father, looked at Alok and waved his hand. Alok waved back, his heart feeling full. Raphael. It was common for the first Omega child to take their mother's name. It was a name that suited the lovely Omega child very well. Klop came to the cabin at late night. Alok, who had been waiting for him without doing anything, got up as soon as the tall man entered the cabin. He spoke with a bit of expectation, during the day, about the child. Alok was so nervous and his heart was pounding so much that he couldn't even look at Klop properly. So his name was Raphael. He's very pretty. He wanted to know more, even just a little bit. There was no specific reason. It was only natural for Alok to be curious. He wasn't asking Klop to let him meet the child. He just hoped that Klop would show a little mercy and tell him anything about Raphael, even small things would do. But when Alok looked up at him with expectations, all he got was a rage that seemed like it could explode at any moment. "Are you done talking?" Unlike his anger, his voice sounded calm, and Alok was confused. Klop grabbed Alok's collar and slammed him to the ground. His light body hit the floor hard. Before he could even understand the situation and stand up properly, Klopp's hand flew towards him. Slap. He covered his throbbing cheek with one hand and turned his head to face Klopp. Klopp tossed his undone cufflink onto the table. As it made a clattering sound, Alok's body was paralyzed with fear of the impending hit. When he saw the man approaching with his sleeves rolled up, slowly casting a shadow over him, he immediately closed his eyes. He didn't know how many times he was hit. It was much more painful than when he had torn his clothes and raped him. Instinctively, Alok curled into a fetal position. Every time Klopp lost his breath and gave him a brief break from hitting, he would spit out the coagulated blood in his mouth. It was painful just to breathe, as if his spine and ribs had been injured. His cheeks were already swollen and burning from the repeated hits by the large hand. Cold drops of water fell on his cheeks. He barely managed to open his eyes. What was harder to bear than the pain was the clear tears that fell from Klopp's eyes, which were filled with anger. Klopp, whose fists were completely covered with red and blue bruises, shouted with furiousness. "Never again. Don't you dare ever again. Never touch my Raphael with your dirty hands. Or I'll burn you alive." He sounded from the bottom of his heart. Alok could only nod, unable to speak. Eventually, Klopp was exhausted and staggered to his feet. Even until the end, tears of sorrow flowed from his eyes. Alok was the proof of the person he couldn't have. Left alone, Alok barely fainted. Shards of his, once innocent, soul shattered, dripping down the irreparable wound on his red cheek. Klopp would often visit and beat Alok mercilessly, his eyes filled with hatred, carrying memories of wailing over his pitiful wife's corpse. It seemed as though the meeting with the child had opened up his old wounds. When he got tired of beating him, sometimes, they would have sex. It was far too rough and painful to be called sex, but at the end of it, Alok could feel a slight sense of pleasure. Then, he would go into heat and become pregnant again. Only then were the beatings stopped. Alok was relieved that he didn't have to get beaten anymore. When Klopp heard that Alok was pregnant, he could only stop hitting him, his fists trembling. Alok almost thought Klopp would slap him like before, but he didn't. The pregnancy this time was extremely difficult. Alok couldn't easily swallow his food. He wasn't being beaten, but sometimes he would feel so much pain that he had to take painkillers. He even came close to miscarrying multiple times. Barely filling the whole 9 months, Alok gave birth to a very small Omega son. After returning to the cabin, in 2 years, Alok gave birth to 2 more children. Although Alok had given birth to 4 children now, Klopp had never properly told him their names. The one name he knew only constantly reminded him of his own sin. Volume 1 Chapter 9.2. Not this time. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Alok groaned as he curled up in pain. His weakened body couldn't endure the repeated births and he rapidly became frail. He couldn't stand a moment without painkillers. Alok struggled to stand up and ate some vegetable porridge, which he could cook well now, and leftover meat from when he was pregnant. But soon vomited everything out. He couldn't digest anything. He continued to have intermittent bleeding and his fever kept rising. Every time he laid his creaking body down at night, he felt like he was lying down in a shabby coffin. Sometimes he wished to close his eyes and never open them again. It hurt too much. But even that wasn't easy. In the pitch-black darkness where he couldn't distinguish between dream and reality, he would have the desire to see the man, who rarely appeared out of nowhere, and look down at him, just one more time. He wished the man would look at him and smile, just once. Then maybe he would leave so the man's sorrow would disappear. Yeah. As you said, I am a blue-blooded demon. I could just let you go, but I am greedy and clinging to something that you won't allow even until the end. Regardless of how much pain it caused the man to have. Now, he couldn't even tell how much time had passed. How long had he passed out? Today, the bed was unusually cozy. And his body didn't feel any pain. It was strange. His body should have hurt in the chilly air, something warm was tightly wrapped around me. What is this? When he opened my eyes, he saw not the dull walls of the cabin, but someone's arms. He blinked his eyes, trying to focus. A familiar nape. It was Clop. His quiet heart began to race. Why was he sleeping here? Did something happen? Or was he trying to bring him back alive again, like before when he was dying? Honestly, none of that mattered. It just felt so nice. Being held in Clop's arms, he wished time would stop, even for a moment. Afraid that he would wake up and leave him, Alok held his breath and breathed in Clop's scent. It made him dizzy, like inhaling a strong anesthetic more powerful than any painkiller. Now, he felt completely like an Omega. No, he was an Omega who had given birth to his children. But just smelling Clop's scent made his body and soul relieved of pain, and he felt peaceful. Even though Clop wouldn't allow his desire, his body had recognized him as his alpha since a long time ago. How did it become this way? Just what was so good about Clop? He was merely a half-aristocrat from the countryside. Alok smiled a little. If he knew it would turn out this way, he wouldn't have done such a thing. What use was it to be curious about him now? Alok cautiously rested his forehead on Clop's chest. Thump thump. He could feel his heart beating powerfully close to him. He wished he could just die and disappear like this, but that was impossible. Soon, Clop would open his eyes and sneer at him with contempt. See, I was right. What makes you all happy and smiley? I don't know either. Crazy bastard. Clop muttered dismissively and shoved Alok away. As their heated bodies separated, a chill ran down Alok's spine. Alok curled up against him, hoping to hold on to the warmth even just a little bit longer. Meanwhile, Clop sat up on the bed. He grumbled with annoyance and let out a small stream of curses, clearly unhappy with the situation. While lying down and looking at Clop, Alok suddenly noticed that Clop had an erection. It was clearly a morning wood, as he was still a young alpha in his prime. Even though Clop spoke to him with contempt, Alok felt like it wasn't as harsh. Was it because he wasn't fully awake yet? Feeling his heart racing in his chest, unknowingly, Alok blurted out. Do you want to have sex? Clop quickly turned his head and glared at him. Alok spewed out that nonsense without thinking, influenced by his own alpha scent. He remembered asking the same thing before and getting called a vulgar aristocrat for it. He expected to hear Clop call him crazy, but surprisingly, Clop didn't say anything. Instead, he climbed onto the bed with a twisted smile. For the first time, Alok understood why people say sex is sweet. It was only once, but he felt like he was melting like candy. If he was in his heat, he was sure that he would have conceived twins. He also realized that there was a sweet poison to it. Do you like this so much, you devil? Ah, Clop, hngggg. You've been beaten and despised so much, you're like a dirty whore with no pride. Who would ever know that you were once a high-class nobleman? He whispered with a sweet voice mixed with contempt. It was hard to keep hearing harsh words despite knowing Clop's intense hatred for him. His broken soul seemed to still be functioning as he felt very hurt. It felt like his heart was being ripped out alive. Please, quickly make his senses feel numb. Let him forget reality and be consumed by false happiness until the end. He showed up quite frequently after that. His previous violence and anger were gone, instead, they always had passionate sex. The repeated happiness he got from it made him increasingly afraid. He wondered if he would eventually believe this happiness to be reality if it kept happening for a few more times. However, he couldn't fall into that madness because of the harsh experiences that he had learned. Also, the kind but cruel Avenger wouldn't allow it. Before the dream-like ecstasy had completely faded away, Clop whispered affectionately in the panting Omega's ear, without taking out his penis that ejaculated inside Alok. You're trying so hard. If you're human, you should act like one. Try crying and begging for forgiveness. Every time, Alok would try his best. He contorted his face and tried to open his trembling lips to ask for forgiveness, but it wasn't easy. Tears wouldn't come out. If he could, Alok would have cried until his entire body melted away. Stroking Alok's slightly flushed cheek from trying so hard, Klopp smiled. You're a disgusting demon. Left alone, Alok wanted to cry. He really did feel that. But why couldn't he cry? Later, he felt that if he just cried, Klopp would forgive him for everything. It felt like everything would turn out okay if he just kneeled down and begged while crying. He gradually reached his limit. Even after realizing that gentle sex was more painful than rough and violent sex, Alok couldn't express anything. Klopp was cruel. The feeling of being stroked gently without hiding his disgust was incredibly miserable and painful. It was like Alok was standing at the edge of a cliff with everything crumbling around him. A few more steps and he would fall into a ceaseless hell. In the midst of the slightly rough yet extremely affectionate movements, Alok grabbed the person's clothes who was pushing him away. Alok was in heat. For 2 days, he felt like he really was going to die, and yet during that, Klopp held him like a very caring lover. The heat that started from his toes gradually rose to his heart, and Alok felt his climax. Salty fluid flowed down his trembling eyes. How nice would it have been if they were tears? Klopp got up and put his clothes back on, sighing heavily as he got off the bed. If you get pregnant this time, give birth to the child. And this is the end of it. Why? I've had enough now. His world came crashing down. He was sure he was lying on a firm bed, but he felt like he was constantly falling, his insides churning. Was he getting abandoned? Was he really getting abandoned for good this time? He wanted to beg for forgiveness and ask to stay by his side, but he didn't have a possible way to ask for forgiveness. This would be the first time he had ever prayed not to be pregnant. But his body, which was in a miserable state without medication, faithfully responded to his alpha and conceived a life. When the first morning sickness came, Alok was in shock. He sat still, feeling helpless. As his belly was getting bigger, Alok was unable to catch Klopp, who made brief stops in the cabin. With a twisted expression, he could only watch Klopp's back as he stepped outside. There wasn't much time left now. He wanted to see him a little more, but his body was hurting so much that he couldn't even walk properly. He could barely even take a few steps, before he collapsed, hugging his swollen belly. The time he thought was happiness was fleeting, and the illusion of his satisfaction was quickly shattered in his pain. It hurt. It hurt too much to endure. He was reaching for the bottle of painkillers and spilled it. He sobbed while swallowing the white pill on the ground as if it were the raisins. But even then, his tears didn't appear. His head was dizzy from the strong medicine. How to get out of this place that's full of only pain? Groaning in pain and tossing his body all night, he remembered Klopp's gentle whisper. Maybe he had been too skinny before. Grabbing his much bigger belly than usual, Alok stumbled to his feet on trembling legs. No one was there to catch him from the beginning. Klopp just kept him alive here, but he didn't tie him up. Just like what he had said before, the door was not locked, and Alok could leave the cabin whenever he wanted. Daybreak. For the first time, Alok left the estate on his own will. We're almost at the end of Volume 1. Next update will be a long one. Make me feel happy and supported by leaving a comment. Volume 1 Chapter 10.1. Trapped in the Living Hell. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Late at night. Klopp came to the cabin again. And he looked down at the Omega, who had fainted, breathing heavily in the darkness with a pained expression. His pale skin was still stained with faint bruises from when he had hit him in anger after he talked to their son. He had become very weak. It was only natural, he had given birth to 4 children. Even if he was an Omega, male childbirth was not encouraged. Only 1 or 2, and 3 at most. Moreover, Alok wasn't even a natural-born Omega. He was still alive only because of his strong vitality as an Alpha previously. So he couldn't die early and suffered more, but now, even that tough vitality was fading away. Alok looked a lot like his deceased wife, Raphael. But at first, he didn't think they had anything in common. His deceased wife had a thoughtful and meticulous personality, while Alok was an arrogant and unpleasant aristocrat. But looking at Alok, who was dying now, they seemed to indeed share the same bloodline. Especially after giving birth, Alok's body lines became thin and round, making him resemble Raphael so much that sometimes his heart would beat fast. "I'm a madman," he said to himself. He felt severely ashamed of himself. Even if it was for revenge, it was disgusting to find himself aroused while looking at the enemy who had miserably killed his wife. He was the worst for being conflicted whenever he saw Alok. Klopp had a rough idea of what Alok had suffered at the bottom of his life. To succeed while having nothing, sometimes he had to join hands with those who had given up their humanity. He knew well the physiology of those who had struggled desperately at the bottom of their lives. He had secretly shed tears every day, suffering and in pain, but Alok seemed to be different. When Alok returned to the estate, Klopp had an indescribable feeling seeing him radiating a nobility from head to toe, dressed in old, tattered, and plain clothes. He held his head high as if nothing could tarnish him, and he still had his old mannerisms with a faint smile. The way he looked directly at him made his skin crawl. He had wanted to hurt the untouchable and shining being by making fun of his count title and his family, but it was childish. Despite his pale and withered complexion, Alok calmly handled the situation, commenting lightly on the paintings of an upcoming new artist and elegantly sipping his tea. Then, like a nobleman responding to an invitation from a host, he mentioned the child with proper etiquette. "Your child was beautiful." Klopp thought Alok was mocking him, calling the child he had birthed as if he was someone else's child. He was a loathsome being who had no emotions at all. He had an impulse to smash that unbreakable mask. It's because he resembled his mother. He mocked intentionally, pointing out that those children were Alok's own. Alok seemed shocked by that. Klopp had never seen him so shaken by sharp words. Klopp was quite satisfied with the unexpected reaction. Even in the midst of shock, Alok complimented the tea with courteous manners and left the estate with a sophisticated thank you that was neither excessive nor inadequate for the hospitality. Watching him walk away from the window, Klopp felt strange. Alok's steps were always light as if he was dancing, but now they seemed weightless as if he could get carried away by the wind. He had a premonition that the faint silhouette could disappear at any moment, that he might never see it again. He quickly told the gatekeeper, Hagen, to follow him. Late that night, the watchman returned with a drenched and confused Alok. "I rescued him from jumping into the river." Even in his fainting state, he embraced and carried Alok's shivering body with blue lips. He led him to the bathroom attached to the room used by the former count. As hot water filled the bathtub, he took off Alok's clothes. His skinny body was covered with unknown scars and filth. When he was put into warm water, he panicked from the sudden temperature change. In his fainted state, he couldn't breathe properly. He was shivering and gasping, so Klopp had to help his breathing by kissing him. Alok was unable to sit up straight and slipped into the water, so he had no choice but to embrace him in the bathtub without even taking off his own clothes. Thin legs floated in the splashing water like twigs. Unlike his own legs which were wrapped in dark fabric, Alok's pale legs looked as if they were melting into the hot water, along with his powerless, dangling arms. He held his bony and motionless hand, intertwining their fingers. Alok's head lolled naturally on his shoulder, touching and wetting the nape of his neck. His thin breaths echoed in his ear. "I won't allow you to die so easily." Klopp couldn't believe that Alok attempted to end his own life. He didn't know if Alok hated him so much for mocking him about how he gave birth to his child. He couldn't describe his feelings at that time. All he remembered was that he couldn't let it end like this, fueled by his burning anger. He wanted to make him miserable, to cry and scream like he did, to make him suffer. At first, he deliberately drugged him to destroy his self-esteem and just to have a child from him. Then, he saw the wet eyes that wanted him to penetrate the Omega when he was in heat. It was the few times Alok showed emotions, so he felt a sickening sense of triumph and raped him again and again. Despite knowing that his artificially created Omega body couldn't withstand repeated pregnancy and childbirth, he didn't stop. He wished for him to endure more pain and scream more. Fueled by the bitter hatred and malice, he kept going like that. When he had found him starving to death alone in the cabin just after giving birth to their first child, Klopp was furious at the thought of letting him go so easily. Despite his ambiguous body that seemed both like Omega and Alpha, Klopp picked him up in his arms and took him to the estate to save his life. On the way there, Alok had regained consciousness, then he arrogantly smiled and wrapped his arms around Klopp's neck, causing him to shiver at the cost of his overbearing confidence. After giving birth to their second child, he had simply thrown him on the back burner and forgot about him. No, he tried tirelessly to forget him. Unlike their second child who resembled himself, their first child became more and more similar to his birth mother as he grew up. He had insisted on naming him Raphael, but every time he called him by the name, he felt a pang in his heart. That's when he realized he was trapped in the hell he had created for himself, consumed by hatred and losing his mind. He poured more hot water to keep him from getting cold. After he confirmed that Alok's complexion had returned, he took him back to the cabin and laid him down. He couldn't allow himself to be generous enough to give him comfort in the estate. He had to suffer more. At least until he shed uncontrollable tears of blood as he did. He didn't know why, but when Alok woke up, he didn't try to run away anymore. The door of the cabin was not locked, and the estate's gate did not prevent him from leaving. But he was always there, like a person trapped behind transparent bars. He watched him go back and forth between the cabin from the window of the estate. He felt strange as Alok pumped the prepared water. To think that the Count, who used to order him around with a proud look, would do such a thing. Did he learn that when he was at the bottom of his life? He thought Alok would endure this without eating or drinking anything again. He expected him to be stubborn and demand to be treated with honor. However, he did not leave the cabin. He didn't even look for Klopp, like on the day he came to the estate with blood between his legs. He was strangely angry. He brought him unprocessed, difficult to handle vegetables on purpose. The next day, a small puff of smoke rose from the cabin. But Alok was still there. As he watched him lying on the hard bed, he brushed off the damp hair stuck to his forehead. No matter how miserable and wretched he was, he couldn't help but exude his innate nobility. Even lying on a shabby bed without anything on, he looked elegant enough to be recognized as a nobleman. His blue eyes, always staring straight ahead, had an incomparable dignity to them. Recently, he realized that his desire for revenge and conquest also made him want to destroy that dignity. Regardless of the motive, being with the Omega who had bore 4 children with him, when he gave a thin smile, it stimulated Klopp's alpha instincts. That, combined with coincidental events that reminded him of his old hatred, always led to uncontrollable situations like an explosive trigger. Even at the moment when he was dying after repeated violence, Alok still looked like a sophisticated, luxurious doll. The only thing that made him look human was his occasional shaking eyes. It was always doubtful whether he was breathing or not. Klopp sat on the edge of the bed and leaned over to place his ear under Alok's nose. He felt a faint breath, and as he turned his head, their lips brushed against each other. Alok's lips were dry, slightly cold, and rough. They looked like Raphael's moist and soft lips, but they felt so different. Alok was cold. As cold as his breaths, his hands and feet were also as cold as his soul. The only thing alive about him were his haughty eyes that scrutinized everyone else. Even they were now shrouded in thin eyelids that revealed his veins. Klopp wanted to peel off this shell that didn't seem like a human being. So that he would cling to him and beg for him. Not just out of fear, but to drop everything, to reveal his nakedly ugly nature, to fall even lower than the humans he looked down upon. He wanted Alok to shout out his name fervently. For Alok to become an ordinary human being and suffer from the sins he had created himself. To do that, he had to keep him alive. It would be useless if he died. Klop lay next to the freezing Alok, warming his body. After spending several years going through heats together, they now had similar scents. It was ironic. To feel such a deep sense of relief from holding someone in his sleep, who he hated so much that he could rip out his heart. It was also proof that they had both become equally vile. As he always knew, Omegas found stability in the scent of the Alpha whom they had continuously mated. As he held him and wiped his cold arms and legs, Alok's pale complexion gradually returned. Even in his sleep, he dug into his embrace with a languid sigh. It was always like this. Despite Klop's cold gaze and attitude, Alok never rebelled, even if he was threatened with a raised hand or cursed at with malice. Unlike what any normal human would do. There was always something stubborn about him that made Klop more angry and annoyed. When he had their second child while living in the estate, Alok became arrogant, as if he was the mistress of a viscount, giving orders around. However, when they returned to the cabin, things were much different. He thought that his endless high and mighty self-confidence had finally started to disappear. But his nature remained the same. Now Alok didn't expect anything from Klop. Alok lived without wanting anything from him anymore, as if he were blaming Klop himself for dwelling on the past. If he had cried or showed some difficulty, he might not have been so neglectful towards him, even if he got ridiculed. A long time had passed, seasons had changed, and they had 2 more children, but Klop was still struggling with anger and hatred, unable to escape from Raphael's death, while Alok was moving forward. He would cook on his own and do his own laundry. No matter what insult he received, he responded with a subtle smile and began to live as best as he could. Had he let go of something at the crossroads of life and death? Or has everything become empty? Even if he was raped roughly, he just whimpered. When he got pregnant, he gave birth to the child as ordered. No desire for anything meant there was no need for struggling. Even if he was alone, he was living and laughing happily. No. That was absolutely not all right. As much as he hated himself and was in pain and conflict, so should Alok. Klop hugged the thin, breathless body as if he could crush it. Do you want to have sex?